recently departed Castro. So I'm going to use both of them. Well, good morning. First of all, I assume everyone enjoyed the dinner last night. It was a remarkable experience. Hopefully most of you attended. It was a fabulous venue, great music. I enjoyed it very much. And then I went straight to bed. I want to thank the ERF for bringing me in onto this project. I came in about halfway, and I appreciate the patience and the support of the ERF as I finalized the data collection for the project on Iran. And I'm glad that I'm representing Iran, but I'm also glad I'm surrounded by Arabists and experts in other countries, because my approach to Iran is usually comparative. And so I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the uniqueness and the generalities of the Iranian case vis-a-vis the countries that you all know so well, and Turkey, of course. Okay, don't forget the Turks. So I'm a sociologist by training and by profession. So my research questions tend to be slightly different than an economist, although it seems like we're meeting at the intersection of politics, which is fine by me. So this is the outline of the talk today. First, I'm going to raise the question, who owns Iran? And I'm also going to try to raise the question, why does it matter who owns Iran? And then I'm going to give a brief history of the rise of what we might call the parastatal sector in the Islamic Republic in the post-revolutionary period. And then I'm going to present an analysis of data from the Tehran Stock Exchange, compiled in 2014. And then I'm going to talk a bit about the form of business in Iran, specifically among the top 100, 200 companies, the commanding heights of the Iranian economy, and talk about the conglomerate form as a type of organizational strategy and some more comparative thoughts on what that means for the Middle East, because it seems like the main finding, or at least the main emphasis of most of the papers thus far, and this paper as well, is that over the last 2 decades in the region, an emphasis by political elites, economic elites, foreign institutions towards liberalization has not removed the crony linkage or the political linkage between different parts of the economy and the state. So with liberalization, we don't end up with autonomous private sectors, as had been hoped by reformers, but instead a new ecosystem where old and new actors have linkages to the state, but exercise them perhaps in different ways. So the conglomerate might be one of these ways. Okay, so if you've been reading the news about Iran, I don't follow the Arabic news on Iran, but I follow French, English, and Persian. Once in a while, you'll see an article or an op-ed, or maybe a think tank report out of Washington, D.C., who claims to tell you who owns Iran. And based on the decade that you were reading, you usually would get a different answer. This is the laser? Yes. Okay. So in the 1990s, when people first started trying to figure this out in Iran, the main story that came out was that it was a set of foundations in Iran that rose after the 1979 revolution, the largest of which is this Bunyad Mustasafan, foundation of the dispossessed or oppressed, that controlled a large swath of the Iranian economy, had taken over many of the public and industrial firms that had been inherited from the Pahlavi monarchy, and had also been gobbling up land, assets, banks, etc. But it was generally an anecdotal story, not a systematic one. This story changed in the 2000s with the rise of new right-wing government in Iran, and the story switched to the one wherein the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was argued to own Iran, control the commanding heights of the Iranian economy. This is, of course, revolutionary motif with the Kalashnikov raised high. And then more recently, There have been some newspaper reports based on spotty but existing data that the leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran has an office. It's not just a nice office; it's a bureaucracy, tens of thousands of employees, and it has an investment arm that owns many companies in Iran. So the new narrative today is that it's actually the leader, in a sort of sultanistic fashion, that owns Iran. Generally left out of this story are many other organizations which arguably own Iran as much as these organizations own Iran. I'm just giving you a few examples. I could have filled the whole slide with them, but this is the Social Security Investment Corporation. As was the case in many of the other presentations, the largest pension fund in Iran is the Social Security Organization. It has many investment companies attached to it. The largest one, as I'll detail a bit later, is highly active in ownership in major companies in Iran across sectors. But that's not the only fund or endowed entity in Iran that's active in the economy. This is one that no one has ever heard of except people who basically study social insurance in Iran. This is the Rural and Nomads Insurance Fund, which was started after the revolution during the Iran-Iraq War. It's not a major one, but if you take a look at sectors in the Iranian economy, such as food, electronics, you'll see this fund as quite active in ownership in major companies. And then I put in a bank, one of many Iranian banks. This is Banque Pasargad. And this bank used to be public, now has private and public, so it's sort of a joint venture bank. It's one of the major banks in Iran. And if you take a look at the banking sector in Iran, you might think that the banks own Iran, since they are quite active in Iran's major companies. So the problem here is that as long as I've studied Iran, I've read anecdotal accounts of who owns Iran, why this somehow displaces the private sector through a single entity. But these are stories. So in the spirit of ERF, I tried to be a bit more systematic about this question. Now, I should say that I envy some of the other presenters here. The data limitations on Iran are much higher than in Egypt, Lebanon, Tunisia, specifically Tunisia. There is no firm census data in Iran that goes all the way down to based on establishment size. Nevertheless, this project is based on recent, more transparent initiatives by segments of the Iranian economy to release some data. So as data comes out, I've tried to make sense of it, and hopefully in the future, as I'll say at the end, there's more to come. So let me give you a brief history of the growth of what we call the parastatal sector in Iran. Of course, the term parastatal is used in many middle-income countries from Latin America to Sub-Saharan Africa to East Asia. In Iran, it has unique flavor, but there's many similarities. So after the 1979 revolution and at the beginnings of the Iran-Iraq War, largely through ad hoc measures, the commanding heights of the Iranian economy were nationalized, from banking to trade to heavy industry to finance. The private sector generally operated in small and medium enterprises below and in between the public sector in Iran. But at the top, the state dominated the economy, not only because of a revolution, but because of a war. So it was kind of a war etatism. As the war came to an end between Iran and Iraq in the late 1980s, the government at the time made a push for what they called public self-sufficiency in state-owned enterprises. Many were encouraged to generate revenues on their own. These hard budgets generally did not stick. Soft budgets became the norm. Nevertheless, the state reorganized the public sector through a variety of conglomerates that owned cross-sectoral. It was kind of sectorally driven, but it owned a lot of the sort of top companies in Iran. There was an attempt at the time for a privatization of the public sector already by the early 1990s. This was the zeitgeist of the early 90s, as we've already mentioned. So if you were a good manager, of course, you pushed for privatization. Nevertheless, in reality, this was very tepid. Nevertheless, even with large state-owned enterprises dominating every sector of the economy, underneath, you saw in the 1990s already, the private sector, or at least private actors, began to fill the interstices of the Iranian economy, largely through subcontracting chains downstream. Some managers moved from public to private. It's a very common story for probably many of the countries represented here. In the 2000s, this sort of semi-public and state-owned enterprise sector began to invest horizontally both into finance and across other sectors. So these sort of conglomerates started to move into cross-sectoral holdings. At the same time, the government, not only the sort of liberal government of the late 1990s in Iran, but also the new conservative government of the 2000s under Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, prioritized at the discursive level that privatization was the goal of the state, and that selling shares of state-owned enterprises was one of the key mechanisms to drive, the sort of economic growth of the post-revolutionary order. And in fact, while perhaps at the end of the Iran-Iraq War or in the 1990s, when privatization might have been a highly politicized term for some factions versus others in the Iranian political landscape, by the 2000s, the term privatization became widely used by the entirety of the political elite in Iran, from the leader all the way to all the different political factions. And all of them claim that we are in favor of privatization of the public sector, and this is going to be the promise for Iranian economic rejuvenation. And so they did privatize the Iranian public sector, but it didn't end up in the private sector. So the main story of what happened is, instead of public companies ending up in private hands, they ended up in parastatal hands. And they did this through three main different processes. One was that firms were listed on the Tehran stock market, but blocks of shares were auctioned off to specific or selected firms and conglomerates and owners. Another mechanism was a program under Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to carve out share blocks of public companies and give them to provincial investment companies that would manage them on the behalf of individuals in Iran who were given a share in these companies. It was called the Justice Share Program. At the same time, from pension funds to semi-public conglomerates to other types of parastatal activities, the government was increasingly becoming indebted to them. For example, for pension funds, the government had promised to pay arrears to Social Security and to other types of funds. In lieu of paying these arrears, they gave them companies. This has happened in other countries such as China, and in many cases the companies that were given were not the companies that were desired, but these funds ended up taking control over formerly public companies in Iran. So it's estimated that over this period, this is the period of the rule of the government of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, 2005 to 2013, about $80 billion in public assets were transferred to, depending on what your definition is, the parastatal, the semi-public, or the quasi-governmental sector in Iran. And as the people who were engaged in this process always like to say, this was a legal transfer in Iran. There's a legal category in Iranian privatization law called the public non-governmental sector. So pension funds belong to this category, endowments belong to this category, and investment conglomerates linked to military and non-military actors, other sort of semi-state actors, also all belong to this category. So everything is nice and legal. And many of these organizations have their own social constituency. So Obviously, the rural and nomad insurance fund's constituency is rural inhabitants of Iran and nomadic tribes who are registered. Social Security Investment Fund, their constituency are formal sector employees of the private and public sector. There's also a civil servants investment fund, which is very active. The investment fund of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is a cooperative foundation that claims to invest for the benefits of active and veteran members of the Revolutionary Guards, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So as opposed to maybe some of the stories we've heard from the Arab states so far in this workshop, in this conference, in Iran, this is really a story of organizations, not people. So instead of families running large funds or large conglomerates in Iran, because of the specificities of the revolution, we have organizations, not people, who end up as the dominant players in the privatization process. No single political faction in Iran has dominated the political scene since 1979. It's not a one-party state. It's a no-party state. There are no political parties in Iran. You have loose associations of elites, and it's a mystery sometimes how they actually do things. Nevertheless, factional dynamics in Iranian politics has allowed for multiple political entrepreneurs to keep rising and competing in a limited way. So, it doesn't fit many of the political science ideal types. Nevertheless, because no single faction has been dominant in Iranian politics, these funds and economic actors generally are tied to one or another, but they don't disappear. In fact, they kind of get layered onto each other. So, what are the different types of parastatal actors? The Iranian Chamber of Commerce went through a large list and tried to make a typology a few years ago. I found the typology useful. You can find contractors, firms, banks, cooperatives, credit funds, and investment companies under 5 different types of parastatal organizations in Iran. The first one are military institutions, but not just one military institution, but multiple, because of the nature of the Iranian military structure, which is dual in form. The provincial investment companies, of which I earlier described. Welfare and retirement funds, of which I've listed a few, but there are actually quite a few more. Something in Iran we call revolutionary foundations or revolutionary institutions, which got a lot of press in the 1990s. The largest one is Mostasas Fund Bonyad, which claims to invest and derive revenue for the protection and charity of Iran's poorest stratum. And lastly, a major category in the Iranian economy are religious endowments, the largest of which, but not the only one, is the Mashhad-based Imam Reza Shrine, the Astana Quds Radzavi, which is, like many shrine centers, has a waqf attached to it. It's legal. It doesn't have to pay taxes, and it owns quite a lot in eastern Iran. Interesting thing about these different types, if you follow their history from the 1990s onward, they developed along similar organizational lines no matter the ownership type. So all of them end up founding a credit association, which then became a bank, and now are large players in the Iranian economy. So like, for example, corporate systems in Germany or Japan, major conglomerates have a bank at their center, and the bank is the sort of way in which finance and credit is distributed to conglomerate investments. Also, many of them ended up expanding into high-growth sectors as different parts of the economy ended up under duress. You saw both pension funds, military investment activities, and bonyads move into high-growth sectors. Real estate and construction is now dominated by parastatal actors. Transportation in Iran, both in land and sea, and services over the last few years has also been quite active. So how to be a bit more systematic about these as opposed to just list them. So the Tehran stock market used to be a kind of boring place with a lot of cobwebs and old computers, and now is quite active. It has over 300 companies listed. It's about market share is about 60% of GDP. And recently in Iran, over the last 3 or 4 years, institutional investors in these companies have become more public. So you can go to the public site and you can scrape it for institutional investors in large firms in Iran. So what we did with our ERF project support was we took a look at the top 300 companies listed on the Tehran Stock Exchange. And if you take a look on the right, by market share, basically when you get past the first 200, you're looking at basically the large extent of market share of the Iranian economy. We then tried to code each of these institutional investors for a political linkage, and we tried to code a sector for oligopolistic concentration. Like many of the countries that you study here, not all firms are listed on the stock market, so large firms are not listed necessarily, and sometimes firms that are listed don't have the data. There's not a uniform transparency across the Tehran Stock Exchange, even though that's the goal. So in addition, when there was a large firm present in an economic sector that was not listed, we added it to the database, and we tried to figure out how to code it for political linkage. So let me give you some examples of what the sort of raw data looks like and how we coded it. This is the 2 largest pharmaceutical companies in Iran, which dominate the sector. The first one here is Al-Borz Pharmaceutical Company. You can see listed here the percentage of shares owned by different investment firms on the Tehran Stock Exchange. So what we did is we took a look at the firm, tried to decide under which parastatal or other entity it was owned, and then we coded it as a type of capital. And we used 5 different types. Public, parastatal, in the sense parastatal are the sum of the 5 types that was listed, but also we separated out pension as being a separate type of capital. And then we have a provincial and private. I'll show a few other examples here. So 5 types, they all start with P. It rolls off the tongue. So here you can see that parastatal capital, specifically the office of the leader in the investment group associated with it, dominates, it sits on the board and basically owns this company. But it has smaller investors under 10%, but you have to have 20% of shares just to sit on the board, like in many other countries. And this is the case here. So we coded this as a parastatal-dominated firm, or parastatal-owned firm. Its main competitor in Iran is Tamim Pharma, and Tamim Pharma is owned by the Social Security Investment Company, which is the Social Security Organization's main investment fund. So we coded this as a pension capital and a pension-owned firm. So the 2 main companies, pharmaceutical companies in Iran, both highly active in the market. They're market making. They develop generics of European drugs. They expand into corner stores. So they have sort of capitalist practices, both of them, but both of them are parastatal or semi-public. But the sector itself is highly oligopolistic. If we switch to something like auto, again, 2 large firms in the auto sector. The auto sector in Iran is highly strategic, or at least perceived to be highly strategic. This is Iran Khodro, the main auto producer in Iran. It has ownership investments by the Imam's office, but most of it is actually owned by itself. So this is a common form of conglomerate investment where they sort of buy up stocks, buy up shares in their own company, and they protect from shareholder dilution. IDRO is one of the main public industrial conglomerates, which has been around since the revolution. This is its main competitor, Saipa, the other main producer of cars. Now they're getting back into joint ventures with Renault and Peugeot, both of the companies. This is owned by basically itself, but through itself, it's a public sector company still. So what happens when you look at all the sectors across Iran? This is what we did. So on the right is the concentration ratio for each sector, which is, we use a very simple concentration ratio, the top 4 firms in that sector divided by the total market share. And we move from, for example, sugar, where basically you have 4 firms or less, down to sectors like insurance, banking, and food, where it's a far more competitive sector. You have large companies, but there's actually a lot more competition and activity between them. And then you can see, obviously, petroleum, utilities, and here's auto. They're highly oligopolistic. Nevertheless, we coded for if any company, large company in that sector, was majority owned by one of these types of capital, we basically coded it as controlling. You can see that, in no sector is it dominated by a single company and by a single type of actor. Nevertheless, there's variation between sectors. And in some, you do see private firms. For example, in auto, there's a downstream private firm, which is controlled by a private company. Rubber and banking, which is highly competitive, there's private sector activities. So some sectors have lower barriers for entry for both parastatals who want to move in and private capital. No single dominant category of ownership across the top companies can be seen for all sectors in the economy. But the main form of ownership in Iran is the conglomerate. So I want to spend a bit of time on what conglomerates mean in the Iranian economy. This is a business definition, business school definition. So we can take a look at a company like Ghadir. Ghadir is a huge firm. It's so huge that it has its own line in that chart. It's a major investment company, and this is sort of a picture from its website that shows all the different sectors across Iran that it claims to be involved in. And it's what we call, a diversified business group. It used to be owned by the Iranian Export Bank. It was semi-privatized, and now is majority owned by several pension funds. This is the aforementioned Astana Quds, the Imam Reza Shrine, and this is something the BBC did. Basically listed all the different sectors in which it's active. You can see, maybe you can't see, but we have food and drug, agriculture, building, automobiles, energy, communications technology, all companies owned by a religious foundation in Iran. This is the Social Security Investment Company. It owns one of the major telecom mobile companies in Iran, Raitel, and these are all the different sectors of the economy it has representations in. This is a list of companies held by Bonyad Moses Safan itself, which is basically a diversified holding company in Iran. And for example, Bonyad Moses Safan, people don't pay attention to it anymore because it's lost its sheen, but now, recently, we think it's about 150 firms. Only 23 of them are listed on the stock exchange. Its subsidiaries produced about $4.5 billion in revenues in 2014, and the profit had been increasing over the last 10 years, according to reports. It's been expanding into numerous high-growth sectors, and now the leaders of the management of the Bonyad Moses Safan are very keen on management speak. They talk a good game about transparency, et cetera, but nevertheless, they do not reveal the finances of the organization. How many parastatal firms are we talking about in Iran at the lowest level? The Security and Exchange Commission of Iran recently estimated that there were 20,000. 19,000 of them have not disclosed any financial information to the government. In the last few months, if you read the Iranian business press, something very interesting has been happening. While the new government of Hassan Rouhani always claimed they wanted to kind of, again, jolt the private sector and push funds into the private sector, nothing really was happening. But now they are taking back shares from parastatal entities, holding them for the time being, and then supposedly they claim they're going to be looking for private actors with which to sell or divest these shares to. So right now there's a moment of transition in Iran where this parastatal growth might be coming under challenge by a new attempt at state regulation. I'll just conclude with a couple comments about conglomerates in the world economy and in the Middle East. The most famous conglomerate in the world is Samsung. It's family-owned. It has listed and non-listed companies. Like was discussed yesterday in Egypt, the profits of the company are moved around, so sometimes it's very difficult to know in Samsung what's going on. The offices of Samsung were just raided a couple days ago by the Korean government, by the way. And they use cross-sectoral, cross-company holdings to protect stockholder ownership, so to protect family ownership of the chaebol. I want to recommend a very large book, the Handbook of Business Groups by Oxford Press, which is a stunning array of cases across the world, from Israel to Brazil to Mexico to Turkey to East Asia to Indonesia, Malaysia, where sort of business experts on each country goes through the process of how conglomerates in these countries not only survived the liberalization era but thrived. Individual conglomerates collapsed, right? But the form itself thrives. So whether linked to families or linked to the state, in the Chinese case, for example, liberalization does not diminish the ability of the conglomerate form, which is diversified well beyond the vertical corporate structure from Anglo-American business history. It does not diminish the ability of this form to thrive in a sort of new 21st century economic ecosystem. And economists, correct me if I'm wrong, but economists actually have a very difficult time, as far as I was reading, explaining why. The theories of corporations lowering transaction costs cannot explain why, in an era of market opening and liberalization, these forms survive. So in the Iranian case, let's say best case scenario, foreign investment comes into the country. You have private actors that become active in the sort of less oligopolistic sectors. I would wager to say that the form of parastatal capitalism in Iran is not going away and instead deserves our scholarly attention. Thank you.